My name is Lena Hartwell, and I'm 31 years old now. But when I think about where my life split into before and after, I always go back to a single night in March when I was 17. Pittsburgh in late winter has a particular kind of cold. Not the clean, glittering kind from holiday postcards, but a damp, metallic cold that smells like wet asphalt, river water, and diesel from buses grinding up hills. That night, the sky hung low and heavy, the kind that presses down on your shoulders until you feel smaller than you are. I remember the porch light flickering above our row house, the paint peeling along the railing, and my father standing in the doorway like a guard who had already decided I didn't belong inside. His eyes were flat, unreadable, like the steel gray sky behind him. He didn't yell. He didn't hesitate. He just looked at me and said, "Leave. I'm done babysitting a broken kid." The word broken landed harder than the cold air that rushed past him and into the house. I stood there clutching my backpack so tightly my knuckles burned, snow melting into my hair and slipping down the back of my collar. I kept waiting for someone to say this was a mistake, that we'd talk about it in the morning, that things had gotten out of hand. But no one did. My mother stood behind him, arms crossed, jaw tight, and behind her, Carter hovered like a shadow, eyes wide but dry. It hadn't been drugs or sneaking out or some dramatic rebellion that got me thrown out into a snowstorm. It was a lie, carefully constructed, deliberately delivered. Carter had always known how to make a story stick. He understood timing, he understood tears, he understood exactly how to look small and wounded, so our parents would step in and protect him from whatever villain he'd chosen that week. And more often than not, that villain was me. That night, he'd taken my phone while I was in the shower and sent messages from my account to a girl at school. Mean, humiliating messages designed to make it look like I'd been bullying her. Then he'd waited until dinner, waited until our parents were tired and already tense from work. He showed them the screenshots with shaking hands like he was scared of me, like I was dangerous. "She hates me," he whispered into my mother's sweater. "She's trying to make everyone think I'm pathetic." I remember how the living room felt too small for the accusation. Snow rattled against the windows. The radiator hissed like it was irritated by the drama. I tried to explain, tried to say someone must have used my phone, but my father cut me off with a single sharp stop. It was the same tone he used when a dog barked too much. Carter didn't stop there. He lifted his sleeve and showed them bruises on his upper arm, dark, finger-shaped marks. "She grabbed me," he said, voice cracking perfectly at the right syllable. "She pushed me into the door." I stared at him, the room tilting sideways. I had never touched him. Not like that. Not ever. But my mother looked at me like she was searching for something she'd always suspected and had finally found. "Lena," she said quietly, "why would he make that up?" "Because he can," I wanted to scream. "Because you always believe him." Instead, I said, "He's lying." My father's face changed in a way I'd never seen before. Something colder than anger, something closer to contempt. "You've always been off," he muttered, like there's something wrong with you. And then he opened the door. Standing on that porch, I felt the exact moment my place in that house dissolved. The wind cut straight through my coat, sharp enough to steal my breath. I thought maybe it was a bluff, that he'd call me back in after a few minutes, that this was some twisted lesson meant to scare me into compliance. But when I hesitated, he stepped aside and said it again. "Get out!" My mother didn't argue. She didn't even look at me. Carter stayed just far enough back to avoid my eyes. I stepped into the snow because there was nowhere else to step. The door closed behind me with a final, solid click that sounded louder than it should have. For a second, I just stood there, staring at the wood grain, half expecting it to swing open again. It didn't. The porch light flickered once more, and then the cold settled in like it had been waiting for this invitation. I pulled my backpack higher on my shoulder and walked down the steps into the street, not because I had a plan, but because standing still felt like admitting I had nowhere to go. My phone buzzed in my hand. Low battery. I called Nora first. Straight to voicemail. I tried my aunt. No answer. Each unanswered ring made the city feel bigger and more indifferent. The streetlights turned the falling snow into glittering static, and the houses on either side of me looked sealed shut against the world. I kept walking because if I stopped, I knew I'd start crying. And crying felt too much like surrender. Behind me, the house where I'd grown up looked the same as it always had. Brick front, narrow windows, porch light glowing faintly. But I knew, with a clarity that hurt, that it wasn't my home anymore. The next clear memory I have from that night isn't of falling or slipping, or even the moment my body gave out. It's of light. Harsh, fluorescent light that hummed faintly overhead, and the rhythmic beep of a machine measuring something I wasn't strong enough to measure myself. When I tried to swallow, my throat felt raw, like I'd inhaled ice. My tongue was thick. My head pulsed with a deep, nauseating ache that made it hard to tell where I ended and the pain began. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was. I just knew I wasn't outside anymore. I wasn't cold in the way I'd been cold on the river trail, where the wind had cut through my coat and my socks had soaked through, until my toes felt like they didn't belong to me. This cold was different, internal, shaking, like my body hadn't caught up with the fact that I was somewhere warm. I forced my eyes open and the ceiling blurred into view, white tiles interrupted by fluorescent panels. A hospital. The realization came slowly, like something surfacing through thick water. And then I turned my head slightly, and I saw her. Dr. Marisol Klein was sitting in the chair beside my bed exactly the way I remembered from the doorway, upright, composed, one hand resting lightly on the blanket near my wrist, not gripping, not restraining, just present. Her silver-streaked hair was pinned back neatly, and even in scrubs, she carried herself like someone who didn't need to raise her voice to command a room. She noticed my eyes moving and leaned forward just enough for me to see her clearly. "You're awake," she said, her tone steady, almost relieved but not dramatic about it. "Good." I tried to speak, but what came out was more air than sound. She reached for a cup with a sponge swab and gently touched it to my lips. "Slowly," she said. "You had hypothermia? Mild concussion? You're lucky." Lucky. The word felt strange in my head. Lucky wasn't how I would have described myself an hour earlier, alone in the snow, phone dead, river dark and endless beside me. I blinked at her, trying to piece together what had happened. Fragments floated up, the trail slick under my boots, the sound of the river rushing louder than it should have been, headlights in the distance, and then nothing. "You were found near the river," she continued quietly, as if she knew I was trying to assemble the memory. "You lost consciousness. I was driving home from the hospital. I saw something on the path that didn't look right." She paused for half a breath. "It was you." The simplicity of it almost broke me. It wasn't fate or destiny or some dramatic rescue. It was just a woman who saw something wrong and chose to stop. My chest tightened at that thought, because hours earlier, two people who were supposed to see me most clearly had chosen not to. I swallowed again, this time managing a whisper. "My parents?" The word felt complicated in my mouth. Dr. Klein's expression shifted slightly. Not pity, not judgment, just awareness. "They're here," she said. "They stepped out when you were resting." I closed my eyes briefly. Of course they were here. A hospital call changes things. It forces appearances. I wondered if they were angry, embarrassed, defensive. I wondered if Carter had cried again. A knock sounded at the door before it opened. A nurse checked a monitor, scribbled something on a chart, and left. Dr. Klein didn't move from her seat. There was something grounding about that, like she decided her place was there and no one was going to shuffle her aside. "Lena," she said gently, and hearing my name spoken without irritation or accusation made my throat tighten. "I need to ask you something." I looked at her, bracing without knowing why. "Do you feel safe going home?" The question didn't feel rhetorical. It felt like a door. For a second, I saw my father's face in the doorway again, heard the word broken echoing like it was still hanging in the air between us. I thought about the porch light flickering, the snow filling my footprints as if I'd never been there. I thought about my mother not meeting my eyes. My answer came before I had time to analyze it. "No." It was barely audible, but it was firm. Dr. Klein nodded once, as if she'd been expecting that response all along. "Okay," she said simply. Not dramatic, not shocked, just okay. There was power in that, an acceptance that my reality didn't need to be debated. A few minutes later, the door opened again, and this time it was my parents. My father walked in first, jaw tight, shoulders squared like he was entering a courtroom instead of a hospital room. My mother hovered behind him, eyes red-rimmed. Carter stayed near the door. No one rushed to my bedside. No one touched my hand. My father cleared his throat. "You gave us quite a scare," he said, as if I'd missed curfew instead of nearly dying in the snow. I looked at him and felt something unfamiliar rising in my chest. Not anger exactly, not sadness either. Something colder, something steadier. Before I could respond, Dr. Klein stood. "She was outside in a snowstorm at midnight," she said, her voice even but edged with steel. 17 years old, hypothermic and unconscious. I'd like to understand how that happened. The room went quiet. My father shifted, clearly unused to being questioned. "It was a family situation," he muttered. "Discipline." Dr. Klein's gaze didn't waver. "Discipline doesn't involve leaving a minor in sub-freezing temperatures," she replied. No one had ever spoken to my father like that in front of me. No one had ever defended me without first asking what I'd done to deserve it. I felt something loosen inside my chest, just slightly, like a knot beginning to untangle. And as my parents stood there uncomfortable under her scrutiny, I realized something important for the first time in my life. Maybe I wasn't the problem. Maybe the cold hadn't started outside on the river trail. Maybe it had started much earlier, inside that house. The morning after I told Dr. Klein I didn't feel safe going home, everything shifted from something that felt like a family disaster to something official. There were forms. There were quiet conversations in hallways. There was a woman with a leather folder and kind eyes who introduced herself as Denise from Child Protective Services. I remember the way she pulled her chair close to my bed, not looming over me, not perching near the door, but sitting at eye level like I deserved that basic respect. My parents weren't in the room when she started asking questions. Dr. Klein had made that very clear the night before. "She needs rest," she had said, but what she'd really meant was privacy, space, safety. Denise's voice was soft but precise. She didn't rush. She didn't fill in the blanks for me. She let silence exist long enough for me to choose whether I wanted to break it. At first, my answers were short. Yes, no, I don't know. It felt disloyal to say too much, even after everything. 17 years of being told I was the difficult one doesn't evaporate in a single hospital night. But Denise didn't push. She asked about school, about how conflicts were usually handled at home, about whether this had ever happened before. And slowly, like someone unwinding thread from a spool, I started telling her the truth. Not just about the night in the snow, but about the years leading up to it. About Carter's lies that always seemed to land in my lap. About my robotics acceptance that quietly disappeared because he was having a hard time. About the way my father would describe me as intense or off whenever I disagreed with him. About how every argument somehow circled back to my supposed instability. Denise took notes, but she never interrupted the flow of my words. She never looked skeptical. She never asked what I'd done to provoke it. When she asked me directly if I felt emotionally or physically safe in that house, my throat tightened. It would have been easier to soften it, to say it was complicated. But I thought about the porch door slamming shut. I thought about the way my father's voice didn't waver when he called me broken. I thought about Carter's dry eyes. "No," I said again, clearer this time. Denise nodded and wrote something down. "Okay," she said, echoing Dr. Klein from the night before. That simple word, okay, felt like permission. Permission to not defend them. Permission to admit that what happened wasn't normal. My parents were brought back into the room later. The energy shifted immediately. My father's shoulders were rigid, like he was bracing for accusation. My mother's hands twisted in her lap. Carter sat near the window, staring at his phone like the entire situation was an inconvenience. Denise's tone remained calm, but it carried authority now. She asked them to explain why I had been outside alone in a storm. My father repeated the same phrase he'd used the night before. Family discipline. He spoke like that was enough. Denise didn't argue, but she didn't accept it either. Leaving a minor unsupervised in severe weather can constitute neglect, she said evenly. The word neglect seemed to land heavier than broken ever had. My father flushed. My mother's lips parted slightly, like she was about to object, but she didn't. Dr. Klein stood near the foot of my bed during that conversation, arms folded loosely, not aggressive, but unmistakably present. She didn't let the discussion drift into character assessments or vague statements about my temperament. Every time my father tried to suggest that I was emotionally unstable, she gently redirected the focus. "We're discussing the events of last night," she would say. A 17-year-old was left outside in life-threatening conditions. For the first time, the narrative wasn't about whether I was too sensitive or dramatic. It was about actions, choices, consequences. After they were asked to step out again, Denise leaned toward me. "You have options," she said quietly. "You don't have to return home immediately. We can look at temporary placements." The word placement made my stomach drop. Foster care, group homes, strangers. I imagined packing the rest of my life into a trash bag and bouncing from house to house. The thought terrified me almost as much as going back. "I don't have anyone," I admitted. It felt like confessing a failure. Denise didn't react with pity. She just nodded thoughtfully. That's when Dr. Klein spoke up from behind her. "She can stay with me," she said, as calmly as if she were offering to drive me home from school. The room went still. Denise turned toward her. "Doctor, that's a significant commitment." Dr. Klein didn't hesitate. "I'm aware." She looked at me, not at my parents, not at the social worker. "I have the space, and I believe stability matters right now." My breath caught. No one had ever volunteered for me like that, not as a burden, not as a responsibility they were forced into, as a choice. Denise asked a few practical questions, background checks, home evaluations, procedural steps. Dr. Klein answered everyone with quiet confidence. It was clear she wasn't acting impulsively. She had thought this through the moment I'd said I didn't feel safe. When my parents were informed that I wouldn't be discharged back into their custody immediately, my father's composure cracked for the first time. "You can't just take her," he snapped, looking at Dr. Klein like she was stealing something from him. She didn't flinch. "I'm not taking anything," she replied evenly. "I'm ensuring she's safe." My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue the way I'd expected. Maybe she knew. Maybe, deep down, she understood that something had broken long before that night. Later, when the room was quiet again, I looked at Dr. Klein and whispered, "Why would you do this?" She pulled her chair closer, resting her forearms on her knees so we were eye to eye. "Because someone once did it for me," she said. "And because you deserve the chance to grow up somewhere, you're not treated like a problem to solve." The words settled into me slowly, like warmth returning to numb fingers. For years, I had internalized the idea that I was too much or not enough, depending on the day. But sitting there in that hospital bed, with legal forms being processed and a future rearranging itself quietly around me, I felt something unfamiliar rising inside my chest. Not fear, not shame, possibility. Moving into Dr. Klein's house felt less like being relocated, and more like stepping into a parallel universe where the rules were different. The first night I slept there, I woke up twice in a panic, disoriented by the quiet. There was no television murmuring downstairs, no sharp edge of tension humming through the walls, no raised voices cutting through the air. Just the soft whir of the heater and the faint scent of coffee drifting from the kitchen the next morning. Her home in Squirrel Hill wasn't extravagant, but it felt intentional. Shelves lined with books that had been read and reread, framed photographs of former students and colleagues, plants that looked tended rather than decorative. When she showed me the spare bedroom, she didn't call it temporary. She didn't say, "Until we figure something out." She just said, "This is yours." The room had pale walls and a wide window that let in winter light. There was a desk by the window and a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. I stood in the doorway, unsure what to do with that kind of generosity. She handed me a small paint sample card a few days later and said, "You can choose a color if you'd like." I stared at it longer than necessary. No one had ever asked what color I wanted my space to be. The first week was full of logistics, school transfer paperwork, meetings with counselors, updates from Denise, who checked in regularly to make sure I was adjusting. But beneath the administrative shuffle, something deeper was happening. Dr. Klein didn't interrogate me about my past. She didn't analyze my family dynamics over dinner. She asked normal questions. "How was math today? What are you reading? Do you like this tea?" It felt disorienting at first to be treated like an ordinary teenager rather than a problem to manage. When I mentioned robotics one evening, almost offhandedly, like it was a small hobby, I expected polite interest at best. Instead, her eyes lit up. "Tell me about it," she said. I hesitated, then explained the competition structure, the way the coding worked, how our last robot's arm mechanism had malfunctioned because of a torque miscalculation. She listened like it mattered. Like I mattered. Returning to school was harder than I expected. Rumors had spread after the incident. Some classmates whispered. Others stared openly. Carter's version of events had traveled quickly, painting me as volatile, unstable. For a few days, I kept my head down and counted the hours until dismissal. But something shifted when I walked into the robotics lab after school, and the faculty advisor greeted me with a simple, "Glad you're back." No suspicion, no hesitation, just welcome. I threw myself into the work like it was oxygen. Designing, coding, troubleshooting. In the lab, problems had solutions. Circuits either connected or they didn't. Equations either balanced or they didn't. There was no emotional distortion, no rewriting of reality. It was steady ground. At home, Dr. Klein created routines without making them feel imposed. Dinner at the table, phones away. Conversation that moved easily from hospital anecdotes to political debates to my calculus homework. She never spoke badly about my parents, even when I tested the waters with bitter remarks. "People fail in different ways," she would say carefully, "but their failure doesn't define your capacity." It frustrated me sometimes, her refusal to villainize them. Part of me wanted validation that what they did was unforgivable. But what she gave me instead was something steadier, space to decide what I believed without feeding the anger. There were moments when the old reflexes surfaced. If I laughed too loudly, I caught myself. If I mentioned an achievement, I braced for dismissal that never came. When I brought home a test score, 98 in AP Physics, I left the paper on the counter without comment. Dr. Klein found it while making tea and called out, "98? That's impressive." I froze, waiting for the follow-up critique. It never came. She simply smiled. "Well done." The simplicity of it undid me more than any grand speech could have. I went to my room and cried quietly, not because I was sad, but because I wasn't used to praise that didn't come with conditions. Therapy started a few weeks later. Denise had arranged it, and at first I resisted. I didn't want to be analyzed or labeled. But the therapist framed it differently. "This isn't about fixing you," she said. "It's about helping you untangle what isn't yours." That sentence stayed with me. Untangle what isn't yours. Over time, I began to see how deeply I'd internalized the narrative that I was difficult, dramatic, unstable. Every time I felt anger, I questioned whether it was valid. Every time I succeeded, I downplayed it automatically. Therapy didn't erase those habits overnight, but it made them visible. And once visible, they were harder to justify. Months passed, and the legal situation solidified. My parents retained custody on paper, but I remained with Dr. Klein under a formal guardianship arrangement. Carter never reached out. Not once. That silence hurt more than I expected, but it also clarified something. The version of family I'd been clinging to had never really existed. In its place, something quieter began to grow. Not a dramatic replacement, not a fairy tale rescue, just consistency. Dr. Klein showing up to a robotics competition on a Saturday morning. Dr. Klein reviewing my college essay drafts late at night. Dr. Klein asking, "What do you want?" and waiting for the answer. By the time spring softened into summer, I noticed I wasn't flinching at sudden noises anymore. I wasn't shrinking in conversations. I was applying to programs I would have talked myself out of a year earlier. Something fundamental was shifting inside me. Not a loud transformation, but a steady recalibration. For the first time, I wasn't trying to prove I wasn't broken. I was simply living as if I never had been. By the time I graduated high school, the ground beneath my life felt solid in a way it never had before. I still carried pieces of that winter inside me. The porch light, the slam of the door, the word broken, but they no longer dictated the shape of my future. Dr. Klein sat in the front row at my graduation ceremony, clapping before my name had even fully left the principal's mouth. When I crossed the stage to accept my diploma, I didn't scan the crowd hoping to see my parents. I already knew they weren't there. They had sent a card a week earlier. Plain envelope, 3 signatures at the bottom, no message. It felt less like congratulations and more like closure paperwork. I placed it in a drawer and didn't respond. Not out of spite, just because there was nothing to say. College acceptance letters arrived in thick envelopes that smelled faintly of ink and possibility. I chose Penn State for engineering and public policy, a combination that felt ambitious and slightly terrifying. On move-in day, Dr. Klein helped me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs, her hands steady despite the weight. She didn't hover while I arranged my dorm room. She didn't cry dramatically in the hallway. She simply hugged me once, firm and grounding, and said, "Call me if you need to talk something through. Not if you're falling apart. If you need to talk something through." The distinction mattered. She expected me to function, to thrive, not to crumble. College was disorienting at first. No one knew my history. No one had labeled me difficult or unstable. I was just Lena. Quiet at first, observant, more comfortable in labs than at loud parties. I joined engineering clubs. I worked part-time in the campus tech lab. I threw myself into coursework with a focus that bordered on obsession. It wasn't about proving my parents wrong anymore. It was about building something that belonged entirely to me. In my sophomore year, I took a class on public systems and educational access. We studied how students from unstable homes were statistically more likely to drop out of high school, less likely to complete college, more vulnerable to housing insecurity. The data wasn't abstract to me. It was personal. I saw myself in every percentage point. That was the first time the idea took root. Not revenge, not even redemption, but infrastructure. What if there had been a clearer pathway for kids like me? What if there had been emergency housing funds, scholarship flexibility, mentorship programs specifically designed for students displaced from their families? I started researching nonprofit structures late at night, scribbling notes in the margins of textbooks. During my junior year, I pitched a small pilot initiative through a campus innovation grant, a microfund to support students facing sudden housing instability. It was modest at first, $5,000 pooled from alumni donations and matched by a university fund. We helped 3 students that year stay enrolled instead of dropping out. 3 felt small on paper. It felt enormous to me. After graduation, I stayed in Pennsylvania and accepted a position as a research analyst for a statewide education policy group. It wasn't glamorous work. I built reports, analyzed trends, attended long meetings where funding was debated in cautious language, but I learned how systems actually functioned, or failed to. Evenings and weekends, I kept building the pilot program. I formalized it into a nonprofit and named it Bridgeline. The name came to me during a late-night train ride between Pittsburgh and Harrisburg. A bridge doesn't erase the gap, I realized. It simply gives you a way across it. That felt honest. The first year Bridgeline operated independently, we assisted 12 students across 3 campuses. Emergency grants, temporary housing stipends, connections to pro bono legal support. We didn't just hand out checks, we built networks. I recruited volunteer mentors, professors, grad students, local professionals, who agreed to check in consistently with each recipient. Stability, I'd learned, isn't just financial, it's relational. Dr. Klein joined the advisory board without hesitation, though she made it clear she wasn't doing it to oversee me. "You don't need supervision," she said. "You need collaboration." Media attention came slowly, then all at once. A local newspaper ran a feature on Bridgeline's impact. A regional education conference invited me to speak about youth displacement and academic retention. I stood behind podiums in rooms full of policymakers and told a version of my story stripped of names but not of truth. I watched people shift in their seats when I described being 17 and suddenly without a home. I watched them take notes when I outlined practical solutions. That mattered more than sympathy. Somewhere during that momentum, I stopped checking my parents' social media profiles. I had done it occasionally in college, scrolling through carefully curated photos of family vacations, Carter's hockey tournaments, holiday dinners where my absence wasn't acknowledged. But the further Bridgeline grew, the less space I had for that kind of self-inflicted ache. Carter graduated high school, then enrolled in business school in Ohio. I learned that through a mutual acquaintance, not from him. We hadn't spoken since the hospital. The silence was its own kind of answer. At 27, Bridgeline secured its first major grant from a national foundation. We expanded to 5 campuses. 38 students assisted in a single year. I hired 2 staff members and moved into a small office space with exposed brick and too many folding chairs. The day we signed the lease, I sat alone in the empty room for a few minutes, letting the weight of it settle. 14 years earlier, I had stood on a porch in the snow believing I was disposable. Now, I was building something designed to ensure other students wouldn't feel that same abandonment. Success didn't erase the past, it didn't rewrite it, but it reframed it. The narrative shifted from broken to builder, from cast out to architect. And as Bridgeline continued to grow, steady, intentional, impact measured in both numbers and names, I understood something with complete clarity. What nearly destroyed me had also revealed what I was capable of creating. At 31, I had gotten used to walking into rooms where no one knew the worst thing that had ever happened to me. I had also gotten used to walking into rooms where people only knew the polished version. The nonprofit founder, the policy advocate, the woman with statistics memorized and grant cycles mapped out 2 years ahead. What I hadn't expected was to walk into a room where both versions of me would collide at once. The email came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing mid-year impact data. The subject line read, "Commencement Keynote Invitation, Lakeview University." I almost ignored it, assuming it was a mass message. But it wasn't. They wanted me specifically. Bridgeline had recently expanded to 3 campuses in Ohio, and Lakeview's president had heard me speak at a statewide education summit. They were looking for a keynote speaker who embodied resilience and institutional change. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, my cursor blinking in the reply box. Commencement speeches are symbolic things. Hope packaged into 20 minutes, applause as punctuation. I'd given conference talks, legislative briefings, media interviews. But a graduation ceremony felt different. Personal. Public in a way that lingered. I accepted before I could talk myself out of it. A week later, the printed program draft arrived in my inbox for review. I skimmed the opening remarks, the faculty names, the student award recipients, and then I saw it. Carter Hartwell, Bachelor of Business Administration. My breath stalled. I read it again, as if the letters might rearrange themselves. They didn't. Lakeview University was Carter's school. I hadn't known. We hadn't spoken in 14 years. I knew he had gone to college in Ohio, but I'd never tracked where. And now, of all the universities in the state, this was the one inviting me to stand on stage. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. There it was, the past threading its way back into the present without warning. My first instinct was to decline politely, to say there had been a scheduling conflict, to avoid the collision entirely. But something steadier rose up instead. Not anger, not fear, just a quiet recognition. I wasn't 17 anymore. I wasn't the girl standing on a porch waiting for the door to reopen. I was the woman who had built something out of that night, and if our paths crossed, it wouldn't be on his terms. I told Dr. Klein over dinner that evening. She set her fork down slowly, studying my face rather than the words. "How do you feel about it?" she asked. Not whether it was dramatic, not whether it would stir things up, just how I felt. "Steady," I said after a moment, and it was true. There was a ripple of nerves beneath it, but not the kind that shakes foundations, the kind that signals something meaningful is about to happen. She nodded. "Then go steady," she said simply. I wrote the speech carefully over the next 2 weeks. I didn't include names. I didn't weaponize the past. I focused on structure, how systems fail vulnerable students, how one intervention can redirect an entire trajectory, how resilience isn't about grit alone, but about access. And then I threaded my story through it, not as spectacle, but as context. A 17-year-old girl forced out in winter, a hospital room, a stranger who chose to stop. I practiced it aloud in my office after hours, adjusting the cadence until the words felt grounded rather than raw. I refused to let the speech become a confrontation. It was about purpose, not revenge. Commencement day arrived bright and warm, a sharp contrast to the snowstorm that had defined my leaving. Lakeview's campus was manicured and sprawling, banners draped between lampposts, families clustered on the lawn taking photos. Backstage, faculty adjusted regalia, and volunteers checked microphone levels. I stood near the curtain and glanced once more at the printed program in my hand. Carter's name sat there in black ink, indistinguishable from the others. That detail struck me, the ordinariness of it. For years, his actions had loomed large in my personal history. But here, he was just one graduate among hundreds. When the university president announced me, "Please welcome Bridgeline founder Lena Hartwell," the applause rose warm and welcoming. I stepped into the light, and there they were, 3 rows back, slightly to the right. My parents looked older, smaller somehow. My mother's hair had gone almost fully gray. My father's shoulders curved inward more than I remembered. Carter sat between them, tassel brushing his cheek as he clapped automatically, until his eyes met mine. The recognition unfolded slowly across his face. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something like fear. His hand stopped mid-clap. My father leaned forward, squinting. My mother's mouth parted slightly. I walked to the podium without breaking stride. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice steady and amplified across the lawn. "Congratulations to the graduating class." I let my gaze sweep the crowd, not lingering on them yet not avoiding them either. I spoke about resilience as infrastructure rather than personality, about how no one succeeds alone, no matter how compelling the myth of self-reliance may be. I told the story of a winter night without dramatizing it, a closed door, a river trail, a trauma surgeon who stopped her car. When I reached the line, that 17-year-old girl was me, a hush rippled outward like a held breath. I didn't look directly at my family, but I could feel the shift. My father's posture stiffening, my mother's hand rising to her chest, Carter going completely still. I finished by speaking about Bridgeline, about students housed, degrees completed, futures salvaged, not by luck but by deliberate intervention. "Your worth," I said finally, "is not determined by who discards you. It's determined by what you build when you're given a chance to stand again." The applause that followed was sustained and rising, not explosive but deeply felt. I stepped back from the microphone and let the sound wash over me, not as validation from them, as confirmation for myself. When I exited the stage, my pulse was steady. My hands weren't shaking. Whatever collision had been waiting for 14 years had already happened, and I was still standing. When the applause finally softened and the ceremony shifted back to diploma announcements, I stepped off the stage and into the shade behind the curtain. My heartbeat was elevated but steady, not the frantic pounding I remembered from being 17 and cornered. This was different. This was the hum of something completed. Faculty members passed by offering warm congratulations, hands clasping mine, voices full of praise for my powerful message and incredible resilience. I thanked them politely, but part of me was elsewhere, aware that just beyond the folding chairs and flower arrangements, my past was sitting in a row of white seats, trying to process what it had just witnessed. I didn't rush out to find them. I didn't scan the crowd. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing for their reaction. It was my father who approached first. I was standing near a long table of bottled water when I sensed someone hesitate a few feet behind me. I turned slowly, already knowing. He looked older than he had from the stage. Age lines deepened, shoulders slightly stooped, as if time had been steadily pressing down. My mother stood beside him, her eyes red-rimmed. Carter hovered half a step back, hands in his pockets, jaw tight. "Lena," my father said, my name sounding unfamiliar in his mouth, like a word he hadn't practiced in years. I nodded once. "Hello." For a moment, none of us knew how to occupy the space between us. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, just a quiet, undeniable reckoning. "We didn't know you'd be here," my mother said softly, as if the surprise itself were the injury. "I'm sure you didn't," I replied. My voice didn't shake. I noticed that with detached gratitude. My father cleared his throat. "Your speech," he trailed off, eyes searching my face for something. Anger, accusation, invitation. "We didn't know," he repeated, weaker this time. "You didn't ask," I said gently, not cruelly. It was simply the truth. Carter finally looked up at me fully. His face carried none of the smug confidence I remembered from that winter night. Instead, there was something fractured in his expression. Shame, maybe? Or the realization that the narrative he'd curated had collapsed in public view. "I was a kid," he said quickly. I didn't think it would go that far." "You were 17, I answered, holding his gaze. The same age I was. The silence that followed wasn't hostile, it was heavy. My mother's hands twisted together. "We've regretted it," she whispered. "Every day." I studied her carefully. 14 years ago, she had stood behind my father and said nothing. That silence had been louder than any accusation. Now she was speaking, but the weight of those lost years sat between us like a closed door that had never reopened. I'm not here for regret, I said calmly. I'm here because of what I built after. My father swallowed hard. Can we talk? He asked. Really talk? Try to fix this? There it was, the word fix. As if the rupture were mechanical, as if tightening the right bolt might restore the original shape. I searched myself for anger and found surprisingly little. What I felt instead was distance, not coldness, just clarity. There's nothing to fix, I said quietly. You made a choice. I made mine. Carter's shoulders slumped slightly. I told people you died, he admitted suddenly, voice low. It was easier than explaining. I let that settle without reacting. I had suspected something like that. Erasure disguised as tragedy. I'm not dead, I said simply, and I'm not broken. Behind me, I felt a familiar presence step closer, not to intervene, just to stand. Dr. Klein had made her way through the post-ceremony crowd, her posture as steady as it had been the night she found me. She didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. Her presence was a quiet reminder of the life I had chosen. My father's eyes flicked toward her, recognition dawning slowly. You, he said faintly, remembering the hospital room, the woman who had asked the question he couldn't answer. Yes, she replied evenly. He seemed to deflate slightly under her gaze, not intimidated, but confronted with the undeniable evidence of what had happened next. I had survived. I had thrived. Not because of them, but in spite of them. We're proud of you, my mother said suddenly, tears sliding down her cheeks. I considered that. The words I had once craved now felt strangely neutral. That's kind of you, I said, and I meant it. But pride from them no longer defined me. Can we see you again? My father pressed. Have dinner? Start somewhere. I shook my head gently. I've built my life carefully, I said. I protect it carefully, too. Carter's eyes glistened. I'm sorry, he whispered, and for the first time, the apology didn't feel performative. It felt small, human, late. I forgive you, I said, surprising even myself with how easily the words came. But forgiveness doesn't mean access. The distinction hung between us, firm, not cruel. My mother covered her mouth, nodding as if she understood, even if she wished she didn't. Dr. Klein touched my elbow lightly. Ready? She asked, the same word she'd used years earlier outside a hospital room. Yes, I said again, and as I turned away, not dramatically, not angrily, just deliberately, I felt something settle inside me completely. The past had stepped into the light, and it hadn't swallowed me. I hadn't shrunk. I hadn't flinched. I walked toward the parking lot beside the woman who had once stopped her car on a dark river trail and decided I was worth saving. And for the first time, the story of that winter night felt finished, not erased, not forgotten, but integrated. They had chosen to close a door. I had chosen to build a bridge. And bridges, once built, don't require you to walk backward. In the weeks after the commencement ceremony, my life didn't explode into drama the way people might expect. There were no screaming phone calls, no public scandals, no long, cinematic confrontations in the rain. What followed instead was quieter, and in some ways, more revealing. My inbox filled with emails from strangers who had attended the ceremony or watched clips of the speech online. Students wrote to tell me they had been couch surfing for months and didn't know programs like Bridgeline existed. Professors reached out, asking how to identify at-risk students without forcing them to disclose trauma publicly. A dean from another university requested a meeting to discuss replicating our emergency housing model. The story that had once belonged solely to me had become something communal, a thread connecting people who had felt alone in their instability. I focused my energy there, on building, refining, expanding, because that was the part that moved forward. My parents, on the other hand, moved tentatively around the edges of my life, like people testing thin ice. The first email from my father arrived 3 days after graduation. The subject line was simple, I'm sorry. The body of the message was longer than I expected, less defensive than I feared. He admitted he had chosen convenience over confrontation, that believing Carter had been easier than questioning the narrative he preferred. He didn't justify throwing me out. He didn't call it discipline this time. He called it failure. I read the email twice, then archived it without responding. Not out of cruelty, out of boundaries. An apology, no matter how sincere, doesn't automatically restore trust. My mother sent a letter instead of an email, handwritten. She described the night I left as the worst mistake of my life. She said she had replayed it in her mind for years, imagining herself stepping forward, saying stop, opening the door before it shut. I felt a flicker of something reading that, not forgiveness, not resentment, just an awareness that regret doesn't reverse time. Carter's message came last. It was shorter than my father's, less polished. He admitted to constructing the lie deliberately, to staging the bruises, to telling people I had died because it was simpler. He said he had believed I would come back eventually, that I would forgive him automatically, because that's what older sisters do. That line lingered with me. It revealed more than he probably intended, the assumption that my role had always been to absorb damage quietly. I replied only once, weeks later, and only to Carter. My message was brief. I told him I accepted his apology. I told him I did not hate him. And I told him that forgiveness did not mean renewed contact. I wished him clarity and growth. Then I closed that door gently, without slamming it, without leaving it ajar. Meanwhile, Bridgeline continued to expand. The Lakeview speech had unintentionally amplified our visibility. Donations increased. 2 universities in neighboring states signed partnership agreements. We launched a mentorship training program designed specifically for faculty members who wanted to support displaced students without overstepping boundaries. I hired a 3rd staff member and moved into a larger office space with actual conference rooms instead of folding tables. Each expansion felt less like a victory and more like a responsibility, a reminder that my story was no longer just mine to carry. It had become a blueprint for change. Dr. Klein remained steady through it all. She never pushed me toward reconciliation. She never suggested I was cold for maintaining distance. When I showed her my father's email, she read it carefully, then handed it back without commentary. "You get to decide what access looks like," she said simply. That sentence settled into me the way her earlier one had, like a foundation stone. For years, access to me had been assumed by biology. Now it was governed by choice. On the anniversary of the night I left, 14 years to the day, I drove alone to the river trail where she had found me. It was early evening, the air cool but not bitter. The river moved steadily beside the path, unconcerned with memory. I stood near the bend where I imagined I had fallen and tried to recall the exact sensation of that cold. I couldn't. Time had softened it. What I felt instead was gratitude, not for the pain itself, but for the interruption that followed it. If Dr. Klein had driven home 5 minutes earlier, or 5 minutes later, if she had assumed the shape on the trail was debris, if she had chosen convenience over curiosity, my life might have ended in that snow. Instead, it had been redirected. I don't romanticize that night. Being thrown out by your parents is not a gift in disguise. But surviving it revealed something fundamental. My worth had never been contingent on their perception of me. It had always been intrinsic, even when I couldn't see it. Today, when I speak to students who feel discarded, I don't promise reconciliation. I don't promise poetic justice. I promise structure. I promise that instability does not have to define the rest of their lives. I promise that one door closing does not eliminate the possibility of another opening, sometimes by a stranger who simply decides to stop her car. My parents still exist in the world. So does Carter. We occupy the same state lines occasionally, the same news cycles, the same digital spaces, but we do not occupy the same life. That distinction no longer feels tragic. It feels honest. Some families are born from blood. Others are built from consistency, courage, and deliberate choice. I was once left in the cold. Now I build bridges for others crossing their own storms. And that, more than reconciliation, feels like peace.